bought you those flowers?" Adriana Hart looked up from the quarterly contracts spread across her desk and found Dominic Vale standing in the doorway of his private office. He was perfectly still. That was the first thing that frightened her. Not the two armed men waiting beyond the glass walls of the executive floor, not the storm throwing silver rain against the 58th-story windows, not even the fact that every conversation in Vale Tower seemed to die whenever Dominic entered a room. It was the stillness. His gaze had settled on the bouquet beside her computer. 12 ivory roses, 1 deep red camellia, black ribbon around the stems. There was no card. Adriana had found them on her desk 15 minutes earlier. She had assumed they were from the junior partners after she saved an acquisition meeting that morning. Now Dominic's expression made the flowers look less like a gift and more like evidence. "I don't know," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. "Try again." "I can't." There wasn't a card. He stepped into the outer office. Dominic Vale was 36, 6'3", and possessed the kind of controlled physical presence that made expensive rooms feel smaller. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his tie loosened by half an inch, dark hair still wet from the rain. The business magazines called him a ruthless real estate billionaire. Chicago prosecutors called him untouchable when they thought microphones were off. Adriana was 28 and had worked for him for 19 months. She knew 3 things with certainty. He never raised his voice. He never repeated an order, and men who lied to him had a strange habit of disappearing from the company directory by morning. Dominic stopped beside her desk and touched 1 pale rose with the back of his finger. "Did someone come up here?" "Security said a courier delivered them." "Which courier?" "I didn't ask for his social security number, Dominic." A tiny muscle moved in his jaw. She should have been more careful. Everyone else called him Mr. Vale. Adriana called him Dominic only when she was irritated, and for reasons she refused to examine, he had never stopped her. "Was it a man?" he asked. She blinked. "So the courier?" "The person who sent them." "I just told you I don't know. Do you have a guess?" The question landed strangely, possessively. Adriana folded her arms. "Why?" Dominic looked at her for 1 long second, then walked past her desk. The executive office doors clicked shut behind him. Then came a second sound, a heavier one. The magnetic security lock engaged. Adriana straightened. "Did you just lock the floor?" "Yes." "Why?" He picked up the bouquet. For the first time, she noticed that his right hand was not entirely clean. A dark smear marked the edge of his cuff. Blood. Her stomach tightened. Dominic tore the black ribbon away from the stems. Something small hit the marble floor, a black metal bead no larger than a blueberry. He crushed it beneath his shoe. A faint electronic crack sounded. The room changed, not visibly. The lights remained warm. Rain continued sliding down the windows. Her computer still showed an unfinished spreadsheet, but Adriana suddenly understood why 2 armed men were outside. Dominic looked at the crushed device, then at the red camellia. His face went colder than she had ever seen it. "Get away from the windows." She stared at him. "What is that?" "Adriana." "No, you don't get to lock me in your office and start giving orders like I'm—" The first bullet struck the glass behind her. The window exploded inward. Dominic crossed the room before she could scream. 1 arm locked around her waist. The other covered her head as he drove them both behind the stone reception counter. A second shot cracked through the storm, then a third. His body was over hers, heavy, controlled, protective. Adriana's ears rang. Somewhere beyond the locked doors, men shouted. Dominic raised his head just enough to speak into the microphone hidden at his cuff. "North roof. 2 shooters minimum. Seal the elevators. Nobody leaves the building." His tone was calm, terrifyingly calm. Adriana stared at the blood on his white shirt where the shattered glass had cut him. "You knew this was going to happen." "No. You knew something." His gaze dropped to her face. For 1 second, the most feared man in Chicago looked less angry than afraid. Then the emotion vanished. He picked up the red camellia from the floor. "This flower means they chose a target." Adriana's mouth went dry. "Who?" Dominic's fingers closed around the stem. "You." 3 hours later, Vale Tower looked like a fortress under siege. Police lights flickered across the rain-slicked plaza 30 floors below. Dominic's private security had emptied the building floor by floor, while his lawyers managed to keep the city police from entering the executive levels without a warrant. Adriana sat on a leather sofa in his private office with a blanket around her shoulders and fury slowly replacing shock. Dominic stood at the bar, speaking in low Italian to a gray-haired man she knew only as Matteo. Neither of them realized she understood enough Italian to catch certain words: Vescari, shipment, message, war, and her name. She waited until Matteo left. Then she stood. "Who is Vescari?" Dominic's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't English." "My grandmother was from Naples." "I know." Of course he knew. The realization chilled her almost as much as the gunfire had. "How much do you know about me?" "Enough." "That isn't an answer." "It is the only one you're getting tonight." She walked toward the door. Dominic moved once, and somehow he was between her and the exit. Adriana stopped inches from his chest. "Move." "No. You cannot keep me here. Someone just put a sniper round through a window 2 feet from your head. That does not give you ownership of me." His expression hardened at the word ownership. "I don't own you." "Then unlock the door." "No." She laughed once without humor. "That sounds a lot like ownership." Dominic leaned closer, not touching her. His voice dropped. "It sounds like survival." Adriana held his gaze. She had seen senior executives break eye contact with him in seconds. She had seen a 6'5" construction union representative start sweating after Dominic went quiet, but she was too angry to be afraid properly. "You asked who bought me flowers like a jealous boyfriend," she said. "Then you found a tracker in them, locked the office, and 3 minutes later someone tried to shoot me. So either you're having the worst romantic crisis in human history, or you've left out several important details." For the first time that night, something almost human passed through his eyes. Not amusement. Close. The first question had nothing to do with the tracker. Adriana froze. Dominic seemed to realize he had said too much. "You were jealous." "No. You absolutely were." His stare sharpened. She should have stopped. She didn't. "That's unbelievable." "Adriana, you terrify half the city, and a bouquet of roses makes you jealous?" His hand came up. For 1 suspended second, she thought he was going to touch her cheek. Instead, his fingers stopped beside her hair and removed a tiny shard of glass caught near her temple. His knuckles brushed nothing but air. "You have no idea what makes me jealous," he said. Her heartbeat stumbled. Then his phone rang. The moment broke. Dominic answered, listened, and his entire face changed. "Where?" Silence. "When?" More silence. Then he looked directly at Adriana. "No police. I'm coming down." He ended the call. "What happened?" she asked. "The courier was found in the underground garage." Found. He's dead. Adriana's anger vanished. Dominic opened a drawer and removed a black handgun. Her eyes went to it. He noticed. You asked who Vescari is? Yes. He runs the only organization in this city arrogant enough to send me a flower before he fires a bullet. Her skin prickled. Send you? Dominic's gaze lowered to the crushed red camellia on the floor. No, he said quietly. He sent it to you because he knows exactly what you are to me. Adriana forgot how to breathe. And what am I to you? Dominic stared at her for a long time. Then he checked the weapon, slid it beneath his jacket, and walked toward the door. The reason you're not going home tonight. The safe house was not a house. It was the top 3 floors of an anonymous black glass building overlooking Lake Michigan, owned through 4 shell companies and guarded by men who carried rifles beneath tailored coats. Adriana learned that because she asked. She asked everything. Dominic answered almost nothing. The armored SUV crossed Chicago after midnight, trailed by 2 identical vehicles. Rain turned the city into smeared gold and red outside the tinted windows. Adriana sat beside Dominic in the back seat, deliberately leaving 6 inches of space between them. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Your apartment is compromised, he said. You don't know that. I do. How? Because a man has been watching your building for 11 days. She turned toward him. You knew someone was watching me? Yes. And you didn't tell me? I had him watched. That is not better. He never approached you. You put surveillance on the person surveilling me? Yes. And who was surveilling me before that? Dominic said nothing. Adriana stared. Oh my God. His jaw tightened. So you were. Security was. For how long? Since you started working for me. 19 months? Yes. You have had people following me for 19 months? To and from work. Why? Because everyone close to me is a vulnerability. I'm your assistant. You're more exposed than my captains. You know my calendar, my travel routes, which meetings I cancel, which names make me leave a room. If someone wanted access to me, they would start with you. She should have accepted the explanation. It was logical. Instead, she remembered the way he had asked about the flowers. Not like a boss. Not like a security threat. Like a man imagining another man sending something beautiful to a woman he had no right to want. Adriana looked out at the city. Who do you think sent them? Lucian Vescari. Why me? Dominic's voice was flat. Because 2 weeks ago, he learned you matter. How? Silence. Dominic. His eyes met hers in the dark reflection of the window. Because I made a mistake. What mistake? I looked at you when I should have looked at him. She turned back. He continued before she could speak. 2 weeks ago, at the charity gala, Vescari's nephew approached you near the staircase. Adriana remembered. A charming man in a white dinner jacket had blocked her path and asked for her number. She had declined. Dominic had appeared 3 seconds later. He had said only 1 sentence. She's working. The man had smiled and walked away. Adriana had forgotten the exchange. Apparently, Dominic had not. You looked at me? She asked. I looked at his hand on your arm. He touched my elbow. I know exactly where he touched you. The answer was too immediate, too dark. Adriana swallowed. What happened to his nephew? Dominic looked forward. He left Chicago. Her eyes narrowed. Voluntarily? Eventually? She stared at him. Dominic did not smile. That was when Adriana understood something far more dangerous than the gunshots. The flowers had not created Dominic Vale's jealousy. They had exposed it. The penthouse safe house had 6 bedrooms, a marble kitchen nobody seemed to use, and windows that turned Lake Michigan into a black sheet of moving glass. It also had no visible locks on the bedroom doors. Adriana noticed that immediately. Dominic noticed her noticing. "You can lock yours from the inside," he said. She set her overnight bag on the bed. One of his men had retrieved it from her apartment after sweeping the building. "Am I supposed to thank you for giving me one door I control?" "No." "Good." He stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled to his forearms now, the cut at his ribs taped beneath a fresh white shirt. Without the suit jacket, he looked less like the CEO whose photograph appeared on financial websites, and more like the man those websites carefully avoided describing. There was a faint scar across one knuckle. Another disappeared beneath his watch. Adriana hated that she noticed either one. "Your phone," he said. "No. It has to be replaced." "It was replaced 6 months ago." "It's compromised." "You say that about everything I own. Right now, everything you own is attached to a woman someone tried to kill. That woman is me." "I'm aware." "Then stop discussing me like an asset." Something in his face shifted. He held out his hand. "Please." Adriana stared at him. Dominic Vale did not say please. Not to board members, not to senators, not to men carrying guns. She slowly placed her phone in his palm. His fingers closed around it without touching hers. "Thank you. Don't make me regret it." His eyes held hers. "That may be beyond me." He left before she could decide what he meant. Adriana lasted 43 minutes in the bedroom. Then the adrenaline wore off. Her hands started shaking so hard she dropped a glass of water. It shattered beside the bed. She stared down at the pieces and suddenly saw the executive window exploding behind her again. The bullet, Dominic's arm around her waist, his body covering hers, the red flower on the floor. Her lungs stopped cooperating. She crouched to pick up the glass. A shard sliced her fingertip. The door opened instantly. Dominic stopped when he saw her on the floor. Adriana looked up sharply. "Were you standing outside?" "Yes." "For 43 minutes?" "Yes." "That is insane." "Probably." He crossed the room and crouched several feet away. He did not reach for her. That surprised her more than if he had. "You're breathing too fast," he said. "I know how breathing works." "Then prove it." She glared at him, but the room tilted. Dominic's voice lowered. "Look at me." "I don't want to." "I know." She did anyway. 4 seconds in, he said. "Hold, then 6 out." She followed him once, again. By the 4th breath, the room stopped spinning. Dominic remained exactly where he was. "Who taught you that?" she asked. "My sister." "You have a sister?" "Had." The single word closed a door she had not known existed. Adriana looked at the blood on her fingertip. Dominic's eyes followed. "May I?" he asked. She nodded. Only then did he move closer. He took her hand with a care that felt almost impossible coming from him. His palm was warm. His thumb steadied her wrist while he wrapped a small bandage around the cut from the emergency kit beneath the bathroom sink. His touch should have felt clinical. It did not. The storm hummed against the glass. They were both too quiet. Adriana became aware of the exact distance between his face and hers. Then Dominic released her hand first. His expression turned hard, almost angry. Not at her, at himself. "Sleep," he said. "Are you going to stand outside all night?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because if anyone reaches this floor, they reach me before they reach you." He walked away. Adriana watched him go and realized that the most unsettling thing about Dominic Vale was no longer that she believed he could hurt someone. It was that she believed completely he would let someone hurt him first. By morning, the city had a different version of the shooting. A structural window failure had occurred during a storm at Vale Tower. No sniper, no dead courier, no red camellia. Dominic's public relations team had erased terror before breakfast. Adriana read the article on the secure phone he gave her and looked across the kitchen island at him. This is a lie. It's a press release. Same thing? Often. He drank espresso while Matteo updated him on security. The older man had silver hair, a tailored navy suit, and the tired expression of someone who had spent decades cleaning blood out of expensive problems. When Matteo finished, his eyes moved to Adriana. "Ms. Hart, I apologize for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience?" she said. "My window was shot out." Matteo glanced at Dominic. "She's exactly as you described." Adriana looked between them. "How did he describe me?" "Matteo," Dominic warned. The older man almost smiled. Persistent. "That is not what you were going to say." "No," Matteo agreed. Dominic's phone rang. The display showed a name Adriana recognized: Nathan Cole, her former boyfriend. Dominic looked at the screen, then at her. His face became unreadable. "Why is Nathan calling you?" Adriana asked. "He isn't." Dominic turned the phone so she could see the message beneath the missed call. Nathan had called the corporate security line asking for Adriana. He had seen news footage of the building and wanted to make sure she was safe. Something sharp entered Dominic's expression. Adriana caught it immediately. "You cannot be serious." "What? You're jealous again. I don't like unknown variables." "You know who Nathan is?" "Yes." Her brows rose. "How?" Dominic took another sip of espresso. "You did a background check on my ex-boyfriend?" "Security did." "When?" 18 months ago." Dominic. "He had 2 unpaid parking tickets and a DUI charge that was dismissed." Adriana stared at him. "That is horrifyingly specific. He also sent you flowers twice." Matteo abruptly became fascinated by the city skyline. Adriana's mouth fell open. "How would you know that?" Dominic set down his cup. "The building logs deliveries." "You remembered them?" "No." "You just quoted the exact number." He gave her a look that could have frozen fire. She smiled despite herself. It was a mistake. Dominic stared at her smile as though it had physically struck him. The moment stretched. Then Matteo cleared his throat. "We have another problem." Dominic looked away first. "Which one?" Someone inside Vale Tower approved the courier's access badge. Adriana's smile disappeared. Matteo placed a tablet on the island. The authorization bore an executive code. Only 12 people had access to that level of clearance. One of them was Adriana. Her code was on the screen. She went cold. "I didn't approve that." Dominic did not answer. She looked at him. "You know I didn't." His silence hurt more than it should have. "Dominic." Matteo spoke carefully. "The code was entered from Ms. Hart's terminal at 6:12 yesterday morning. I wasn't there at 6:12. I arrived at 7:30. We're checking the cameras." "Then check them." "We did," Dominic said. She turned to him. "The camera covering your desk lost signal from 6:08 to 6:16. Adriana's pulse accelerated. Someone had used her computer. Someone had wanted it to look like she had let the courier in. "Do you think I'm working with Vescari?" she asked. Dominic's gaze sharpened. "No." The answer came instantly. Matteo glanced at him. Adriana did too. You didn't even hesitate. I don't need to. You just said everyone close to you is a vulnerability. That doesn't make you a traitor. How can you be sure? Dominic's eyes held hers. Because I know what betrayal looks like. Something dark lived behind the sentence. Mateo's phone vibrated. He checked it and swore under his breath. What? Dominic asked. The security archive recovered one frame before the feed died. He turned the tablet. A man in a maintenance uniform stood behind Adriana's desk, his face partially hidden by a cap. On his wrist was a gold signet ring. Dominic's expression became lethal. Adriana leaned closer. You know him. Yes. Who is he? Dominic took the tablet. My uncle's driver. The safe house went silent. Your uncle? Enzo Vale. Mateo spoke softly. He was at your father's side for 30 years. Dominic looked at the frozen image. And now, he said, he's going to tell me why his man used Adriana's desk to invite an assassin into my building. Enzo Vale arrived at sunset in a black Mercedes accompanied by 4 men. Dominic met him 3 floors below Adriana. Adriana knew this because Dominic had specifically ordered her to remain upstairs. So naturally, she went downstairs. She made it to the mezzanine before Mateo caught her. You are going to shorten my life, he murmured. Your boss already tried to imprison me in a penthouse. For your protection. So he keeps saying. Mateo sighed and did not physically stop her. Below them, the safe house lounge looked like a private club after closing. Low lamps, dark wood, rain beyond the windows. Dominic stood near the fireplace. Across from him was Enzo. The older man was broad, silver-haired, expensive, and smiling. I've known Paolo since he was 19, Enzo said. His son drives for me now. If that boy touched your security system, I'll personally bring him to you. You're generous, Dominic said. He's family. Not mine. Enzo's smile faded. Then his gaze moved upward. He saw Adriana. Everything in his face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Deep, unmistakable recognition. Adriana's breath caught. Enzo looked at Dominic. You brought her here? Dominic's voice went dangerously quiet. Choose your next words carefully. But Adriana was already descending the stairs. You know me, she said. Enzo's eyes returned to her face. I knew your father. The room seemed to lose sound. Adriana stopped 3 steps from the bottom. My father was an accountant in Milwaukee. Enzo laughed once. Dominic did not. No, sweetheart, Enzo said. Your father was an accountant in Chicago. Adriana looked at Dominic. He had gone completely still. That frightened her more than the answer. Tell me he's lying. Dominic said nothing. Her chest tightened. Tell me. I can't. Enzo smiled as if he had been waiting years for that moment. Thomas Hart kept the Vale books, he said, until the night he decided he knew too much. Adriana's face drained of color. Her father had died when she was 14. Car accident, icy road, police report, closed casket. All her life, that had been the truth. Now Dominic looked at her like a man watching a building collapse and knowing he had laid one of the charges. What happened to my father? She whispered. Dominic's voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. Not here. No, right here. Adriana, did your family kill him? Enzo's eyes gleamed. Dominic did not look away. Yes. The word broke something between them. Adriana did not cry. Dominic almost wished she would. Tears he understood. Anger he understood better. The silence in her face terrified him. Enzo took one satisfied breath before Dominic turned on him. Leave. His uncle lifted both hands. "You invited me." "I changed my mind. Dominic, if the girl is going to survive this, she deserves the whole—" Two of Dominic's men appeared beside Enzo before the sentence ended. Dominic never raised his voice. "Get him out!" Enzo's gaze lingered on Adriana as he was escorted toward the elevator. "Ask him where he was the night your father died." The doors closed. Adriana looked at Dominic. "Where were you?" He dismissed everyone else with a glance. Matteo hesitated, then followed. When the room was empty, Dominic walked to the windows. He did not face her. 22 years old, he said. My father had begun giving me pieces of the organization, small ones, enough to learn which men smiled while they stole from you. That does not answer me. Your father called me at 1:16 in the morning. Adriana stopped breathing. Dominic continued. He said he had proof that someone inside our family was selling our shipping routes to Vescari. He wouldn't tell me who over the phone. He said he was leaving the city and taking you and your mother somewhere safe. A dull pressure grew behind Adriana's ribs. I thought he died driving home from a client dinner. That was the report. You made it the report. Yes. The word was barely audible. Adriana's hands curled into fists. Where were you? On Lakeshore Drive, trying to reach him. Dominic finally turned. I got there after the first car hit him and before the second one arrived. Her eyes filled despite every effort. First car? It wasn't an accident. She looked away. The floor seemed to move beneath her. He was alive, Dominic said. That made her look back. He was alive? For 4 minutes. Adriana's face crumpled just once. Dominic crossed half the distance between them, then stopped himself. She saw him stop. That hurt too. What did he say? He told me not to trust anyone who already knew about the ledger. He gave me your name, your mother's name, your aunt's address in Milwaukee. Ledger? I never found it. What else did he say? Dominic's voice lowered. He made me promise you would never be used to finish what he started. Adriana wiped angrily at one tear. So you followed me? Yes. Paid attention to where I lived? Yes. Ran background checks on people I dated? His jaw tightened. After you came to work for me, and you hired me because of him. Dominic was silent too long. Her stomach dropped. You did. You were the strongest candidate. Don't insult me with half-truths now. He took the blow without moving. When your resume reached my desk, I recognized the name. You could have sent me anywhere else in the company. Yes. But you put me outside your office. Yes. Why? His eyes darkened. At first, because I thought I could protect you better if I knew where you were. At first. Dominic said nothing. Adriana laughed shakily. And later? He looked at her the way he had looked at the flowers. Later became complicated. No, later became convenient. You knew who I was. You knew what happened to my father. Every birthday, every anniversary of his death, every time I told you I hated icy roads because of the accident, you knew. Yes. And you let me believe it. His face tightened. I believed the truth would put you back on the board. You don't get to decide which truth I can survive. I know. Do you? Yes. She walked closer, furious now because fury was easier than grief. You keep saying you don't own me, but you've been making decisions for me since before I knew your name. Dominic's voice went quiet. You're right. The admission disarmed her for half a second. I would make different decisions now, he said. Because you respect me? Because I know what it costs when you hate me. Adriana stared at him. There it was. Not charm, not seduction, something raw and badly contained. She stepped back. I'm leaving. His entire body went rigid. No. Her eyes flashed. There it is again. Dominic closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, the command was gone. If you walk out unprotected, Vescari will take you before you reach the river. Then give me protection that doesn't require being locked in your home. He stared at her. It was obvious every instinct in him was screaming against the idea. Finally, he pressed a button on his phone. Matteo, prepare the secondary residence. Ms. Hart chooses who enters. 2 cars outside, no men inside unless she asks. He ended the call. Adriana was stunned. Dominic picked up his jacket. You're free to leave. That easy? No. His eyes met hers. Nothing about letting you walk away is easy. She left anyway. The secondary residence was a 2-bedroom apartment above a private art gallery in River North. Adriana spent the first night awake. The second morning, she asked Matteo to take her home. My apartment, she clarified when he frowned. I need clothes, and I need something that belongs to my mother. Dominic had told him she could choose, so Matteo took her. 2 black SUVs parked outside while Adriana climbed 3 flights to the apartment where she had lived for 6 years. Nothing looked disturbed. Then she opened her mother's jewelry box. The blue velvet lining had been cut open. Adriana stopped. Matteo. He entered immediately. Someone had searched the box and put everything back with almost perfect care. Almost. Adriana removed the false lining her mother had sewn in years ago. Beneath it was a photograph she had never seen. Her father stood outside an old brick church with 3 men. One was Enzo Vale. One was a much younger Lucian Vescari. The third was Dominic. 22 years old, leaner, harder around the eyes, already looking like someone who had been forced to become dangerous too early. On the back of the photograph, her father had written 4 numbers. Bank box, Matteo said. Adriana looked at him. How do you know? Thomas used that numbering system. You knew my father, too. Matteo's expression softened. Yes. Everyone knew. Everyone except her. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Matteo reached for it. Adriana answered first. Hello? A man laughed softly. Your father had the same problem, he said. He always opened doors Dominic wanted closed. Adriana's blood turned cold. Vescari? Lucian, please. Matteo was already signaling to the guards. Where did you get this number? Adriana asked. From the man Dominic trusts to keep you safe. Her eyes moved to Matteo. He looked as alarmed as she felt. Lucian continued. Ask yourself something, Adriana. If Dominic was protecting you for 15 years, why did nobody come for you until you started sitting 10 feet from his office? She said nothing. Maybe you were never the target, Lucian whispered. Maybe you were the key. The line went dead. Matteo took the phone and destroyed the battery against the counter. Who has this location? Adriana asked. Dominic, me, 4 security officers. And Enzo? Matteo's silence answered. A second later, gunfire exploded in the stairwell. Matteo shoved Adriana behind the kitchen wall. The front door shook under a violent impact. One of the guards shouted. Another shot. Glass shattered downstairs. Adriana gripped the photograph so tightly it bent. Matteo drew his weapon. Bathroom, now. She ran. The lights died. In the darkness, someone entered the apartment, not through the front door, through the fire escape window behind her. A gloved hand caught Adriana around the waist. She drove her elbow backward and heard a grunt. The man swore and grabbed her hair. Then the room flashed white. A gunshot cracked inches away. The hand vanished. Adriana fell against the wall. A dark figure crossed the room. For one terrible second, she thought it was another attacker. Then lightning illuminated Dominic's face. Rain soaked his coat. Blood marked his cheek. His eyes looked almost black. The attacker rose. Dominic hit him once and put him through the glass coffee table. It happened so quickly, Adriana barely understood it. Then Dominic was in front of her. "Are you hurt?" His hands hovered near her shoulders without touching. "Adriana, look at me." "I'm fine." "Are you hurt?" "No." Only then did he breathe. Matteo entered from the hall, weapon raised, then lowered it. "How did you know?" Adriana asked Dominic. His gaze moved to the broken window. "Your security feed went dark. So you came yourself?" "Yes." "You have men for that." "I know." "Then why are you here?" His control cracked. "Because I cannot sit in another building while someone comes for you." The words struck harder than the gunshot. Dominic stepped closer. "I tried giving you distance. I tried convincing myself that if I put enough armed men between you and me, I could call that respect." His voice dropped. "I can't." Adriana's heart pounded. He looked furious with himself, terrified for her, and beneath both, something that no longer resembled simple fascination. "Then what do you call it?" she whispered. Dominic's eyes moved over her face. "Fear," she swallowed. "Of Vescari?" "No." The answer was immediate. "Of what I become when I think I'm too late." For one suspended second, neither moved. Then Adriana looked down at the photograph still crushed in her hand. "We're finding that bank box." Dominic's expression hardened. "No." She lifted her eyes. He exhaled once. "Fine." Matteo blinked. Adriana almost smiled. Dominic did not. "But you do not leave my sight." "That sounds like an order." "It is." "Then ask." His jaw flexed. "Stay with me." Adriana looked at the blood on his cheek, the rain on his shoulders, the man unconscious in shattered glass behind him. She should have said no. Instead, she heard herself answer, "Until we find the truth." Dominic's expression changed. He understood the boundary. He also understood what she had given him. "For now," he said, "for now." The bank box belonged to a branch that no longer existed. The number on the photograph led instead to an old First Meridian vault beneath a private members club on LaSalle Street, a place where Chicago families stored things they did not want photographed, taxed, or found. Dominic hated every second of bringing Adriana there. She could tell by the 6 vehicles around them and the way his hand stayed near the inside of his coat as they crossed the underground garage. "You realize subtlety is dead," she murmured. "Subtlety failed yesterday. You brought 20 men." 24. She looked at him. He did not appear embarrassed. The vault manager took one look at Dominic and stopped asking procedural questions. 10 minutes later, Adriana stood before a steel box that had not been opened in 15 years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was not a ledger. There was a small digital recorder, a brass key, and a sealed envelope with her name written in her father's handwriting. Adriana sat down hard in the chair beside the table. Dominic turned away. She looked at him. "What are you doing?" "Giving you privacy." "My father died because of your world." "Yes. And you're the only person alive who heard his last words." Dominic's shoulders tightened. "Stay." He turned back. Adriana opened the envelope. "Addie, if you are reading this, then I failed to come home." She stopped, her vision blurred. Dominic did not move. She forced herself to continue. Her father's letter was not long. It told her that he loved her mother, that he loved the stubborn way Adriana refused to let him win at chess, that none of the choices he had made were hers to carry. Then the letter changed. Thomas Hart wrote that Enzo Vale had secretly partnered with Lucian Vescari to move weapons through Vale-controlled warehouses, laundering the profits through legitimate construction contracts. Thomas had found the accounts and copied everything. He had planned to give the evidence to Dominic because Dominic was trying to drag the family away from narcotics and civilian violence even at 22. The last paragraph made Adriana's hands shake harder. "Dominic does not know where the archive is. Keep it that way unless you have no other choice. If he is alive, he will try to protect you because I asked him to. Do not mistake his guilt for obligation. The boy has already carried too many dead men on his back." Adriana lowered the page. Dominic was staring at the floor. "You never read this?" "No." "You knew he left something for me?" "I suspected. You could have forced the box open." "Yes, but you didn't." "No." "Why?" His eyes met hers. "Because that was yours." The answer hurt in a different way. She picked up the recorder. The battery still worked after a replacement from the vault manager. Thomas Hart's voice filled the small room, older than Adriana remembered, tired, urgent. He named dates, accounts, warehouses, men. Then another voice entered the recording. "Enzo." There was no mistaking it. Thomas accused him of working with Vescari. Enzo laughed. Then came the sentence that turned Dominic's face to stone. "If the boy takes over, we lose everything." Dominic thinks fear should have rules. Vescari's voice answered, "Then make sure the accountant never reaches him." The recording ended. Adriana sat frozen. Dominic reached for the table, his fingertips pressing into steel. "All these years," she whispered, "you thought your father ordered it." "I knew someone in my family did." "And you never knew it was Enzo." "I suspected him. I could never prove it." "Now we can." Dominic looked at the recorder. "No." Adriana stared. "What? Now you can walk away." She almost laughed. "This again?" "You wanted the truth. You have it. I can give the recording to the federal prosecutor through intermediaries. Enzo and Vescari will spend the rest of their lives fighting indictments if they survive long enough to be arrested." "If they survive?" His face was cold again. She understood. "Dominic, he murdered your father. That doesn't make you executioner." "No. Other things did." The darkness in his answer should have frightened her. It did. But she also saw the man who had stood outside her bedroom during a panic attack, the man who had given her another residence when every instinct told him to lock her somewhere he controlled, the man who could have opened her father's box years ago and had not. Adriana stepped closer. "What happens if I walk away?" Dominic's expression became unreadable. "You get a new identity if you want one. A house anywhere in the country, security you never see, enough money that you never have to work for me or anyone else. And you? I remove the people who know your name." "That sounds like a threat." "Not to you." She studied his face. "You really think this is about guilt?" His jaw tightened. "I know what it started as." "And what is it now?" Silence. She took one more step. Dominic backed away. That shocked her. He had never backed away from anyone. "You asked me that already," he said. "You didn't answer." His voice dropped. Because the answer gives you power I don't give people. You already gave it to me. His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, there was nowhere left for him to hide. The flowers made me want to find the man who sent them before I knew there was a tracker. Adriana's pulse jumped. I wanted to know whether he had touched you, whether you smiled when he gave them to you, whether you had plans I didn't know about. Dominic, I know how that sounds. Jealous. Worse. He looked at her with frightening honesty. Dependent. The word hung between them. I can run an organization with 300 men and never need a single one of them to stay. Then you leave my office angry and I know the exact number of minutes until you come back. Adriana's throat tightened. I hear you laugh with someone in the hall and I stop reading whatever is in front of me. I know which coffee you order when you're tired. I know you take the stairs when you're furious. I know you pretend thunder doesn't bother you. He shook his head once, disgusted with the confession. That is not protection. It stopped being protection a long time ago. Adriana stood inches away now. What is it? His gaze dropped to her mouth and immediately returned to her eyes. Something I have no right to ask you to return. She reached for his hand. Dominic went completely still. She threaded her fingers through his. So this doesn't erase the lies. I know. It doesn't mean you get to make decisions for me. I know. And it definitely does not mean I'm forgiving you today. A trace of something warm moved through his eyes. I know. Adriana squeezed his hand once. Good. The vault alarm began screaming. Dominic's expression changed instantly. The lights went red. Matteo's voice exploded through Dominic's earpiece. Garage breach. Enzo's men. Move. Dominic grabbed the recorder with one hand and Adriana with the other. The private elevator doors opened. 2 security men were already down. Dominic shoved Adriana behind the steel vault wall as gunfire cracked through the corridor. For 30 violent seconds, the world became noise and red emergency light. Then Matteo reached them through a service passage. "North exit," he shouted. They ran. The brass key from the box was still in Adriana's fist. She did not understand its purpose until they reached the SUV and found a small inscription engraved along its side. St. Michael's, Lower Sacristy. Dominic saw it too. No. Adriana looked at him. My father hid the archive in the church. And Enzo knows we opened the box. So he knows too. Which is why you're going nowhere near it. She almost argued. Then every phone in the vehicle rang at once. A video appeared on the secure screen. Lucian Vescari stood inside an abandoned church beneath a broken statue of St. Michael. Beside him, kneeling with blood on his face, was Matteo's son. Vescari smiled into the camera. Bring the key, Dominic. Bring the girl. Or I start returning your family in pieces. The screen went black. Matteo made a broken sound beside them. Dominic looked at Adriana. No. She already knew what he meant. You are not trading yourself, he said. Neither is Matteo's son. I'll handle it. How? His silence answered. Adriana looked at the brass key, then at the city racing past the windows. Together, she said. Dominic's expression hardened. Adriana, you wanted me to stay with you. Not like this. Then learn the difference between protecting me and controlling me. He stared at her for a long moment. Finally, he nodded once. Together. St. Michael's had been abandoned after a fire 12 years earlier. Rain came through holes in the roof. Candles burned along the ruined altar, placed there by men who wanted drama with their murder. Black SUVs surrounded the church 3 blocks in every direction, but Dominic entered through the front doors alone. Adriana walked beside him. The image was almost unreal. Dominic in a black suit under shattered stained glass, one hand empty at his side, rain and candlelight cutting across his face. Vescari waited near the altar with Enzo. Matteo's son was tied to a chair. 6 armed men stood in the shadows. Enzo smiled when he saw Adriana. "You have her father's eyes." She gripped the key. "You killed him." "I removed a liability." Dominic moved half a step in front of her. Enzo laughed. "There, that is your weakness, nephew. Your father understood power. You turned it into rules. No children, no hospitals, no schools, no civilians. And now you've built your entire empire around one woman who doesn't even belong in it." Dominic's voice was calm. "She doesn't belong to anyone." Adriana looked at him. Enzo's smile vanished. "Give me the key." Adriana raised it. "Release him first." Vescari pulled a gun and pressed it to Matteo's son's temple. Dominic's body went rigid. "Key," Vescari said. Adriana tossed it across the stone floor. Enzo bent to pick it up. Vescari smiled. "Now Dominic kneels." Adriana turned sharply. Dominic did not hesitate. He went down on one knee, then both. The most feared mafia boss in Chicago knelt on the ruined floor of a church while rain fell through the roof. Not because he had been beaten, because a gun was pointed at someone Adriana had chosen to save. Vescari's smile widened. "Look at you!" Dominic's eyes never left Adriana. "Let her walk out," he said. "You get me." "No," Adriana whispered. Enzo laughed. "This is why Thomas trusted you. He thought there was something decent under all that blood." Dominic looked at his uncle. "You should have worried less about decency and more about where Matteo put his men." Enzo's face changed. The church bells rang. Once, twice. There had been no electricity in St. Michael's for 12 years. On the 3rd bell, the side windows exploded inward. Everything happened at once. Matteo's men came through the sacristy and choir loft. Vescari fired. Dominic lunged toward Adriana. A bullet struck him high in the shoulder. He hit her hard enough to knock them both behind a stone column. Adriana heard herself scream his name. Dominic pushed himself up, blood already soaking his shirt. "I'm fine." "You're shot." "I've been shot before." That is not comforting. Across the sanctuary, Enzo grabbed the brass key and ran toward the lower stairwell. Adriana saw him. So did Dominic. "Stay here," he said. She grabbed his sleeve. "Ask." Even bleeding, even with gunfire breaking stone around them, Dominic stared at her. Then, unbelievably, he said, "Please stay behind me." Adriana nodded. They moved together. In the lower sacristy, Enzo found the hidden archive exactly where Thomas had left it, sealed inside an old iron cabinet behind the altar wall. He also found Adriana waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Dominic was 3 steps behind her, slowed by blood loss. Enzo raised his gun. "You should have stayed ignorant," he told her. Adriana looked at the man who had stolen 15 years of truth from her. "No," she said. "That was everyone else's mistake." Enzo fired. Dominic knocked her aside. The shot hit stone. Adriana fell beside the old cabinet. Her hand closed around the metal recorder she had hidden inside her coat. Enzo aimed again. A single shot cracked from the stairs. Enzo jerked backward. Matteo stood above them, his face wet with rain and tears. Enzo collapsed. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Dominic sank against the wall. Adriana crawled to him. His skin had gone pale. "No," she whispered. "No. Look at me." His eyes opened. A faint smile touched his mouth. "You sound like me." "Don't be funny." "I'm never funny." "Dominic." Her hands pressed against the blood at his shoulder. Above them, the gunfire stopped. Sirens approached in the distance. Dominic looked at her as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "The flowers," he murmured. "What?" "If I'd known who sent them, you would have murdered him?" "Probably." Adriana gave a tearful, furious laugh. His fingers found hers. "I'm sorry I lied to you." "You can apologize when you're not bleeding on a church floor." "I may be less sincere later." "Dominic." His eyes softened. "I love you." The words were quiet. No command, no demand, just truth. Adriana's breath caught. Dominic's eyes drifted closed. "Dominic." He did not answer. For the first time since she met him, Adriana Hart was the one who gave the orders, and every armed man in the church obeyed her. Dominic woke 30 hours later in a private hospital suite with 2 guards outside and Adriana asleep in a chair beside his bed. He watched her for almost a minute before she opened her eyes. "You're staring," she said. "Yes." "That's creepy." "I've been told." She sat up. Relief crossed her face so quickly he almost missed it. Then she hit his uninjured arm. "Ow." "You deserved that." "Probably." "Matteo's son is fine. Vescari is in federal custody. The archive went to prosecutors through 3 law firms, and half of Enzo's network is already making deals." Dominic listened. "You arranged that?" "With Matteo." A shadow of pride entered his eyes. Adriana noticed. "Don't look so pleased. I hired well." "You manipulated well." His expression sobered. "Yes." She leaned back. "If this is going to become anything at all, there are rules." Dominic's brows lifted slightly. "You're giving me rules?" "Yes." He almost smiled. "Go on." "No more secret surveillance." His face tightened. "Dominic." "Fine." "No background checks on people who ask me to dinner." His jaw flexed. "Dominic." "Fine." "No locking doors because you're jealous." That lock saved your life. The security lock saved my life. Your jealousy started before you found the tracker. He had the decency not to argue. "And no deciding what truth I can handle." His expression changed. "That one," he said, "I can promise without negotiation." Adriana looked at him for a long moment. "And one more." "What?" "If you want me to stay, you ask." Dominic reached for her hand. This time he did not stop before touching her. His thumb moved slowly over her knuckles. "Stay." She raised an eyebrow. He exhaled. "Please." Adriana smiled. "For now." It became their answer for everything. For now, she returned to Vale Tower. For now, she kept her apartment. For now, Dominic learned that 3 unanswered text messages did not justify deploying a security team. For now, Adriana learned that dating a mafia boss meant dinner reservations, sometimes involved metal detectors and men named Rocco pretending not to listen. Weeks became months. Vescari's organization fractured under indictments and betrayal. Enzo's death ended the old alliance that had protected corrupt captains for decades. Dominic cut away what remained with the same cold precision that had made men fear him in the first place. He did not become gentle. He did not become harmless. Adriana never asked him to, but he learned to knock. He learned to explain. He learned that protection offered was different from protection imposed, and Adriana learned that loving a dangerous man did not require surrendering herself to him. One Monday morning, she arrived at the rebuilt executive floor at 7:31. Sunlight poured through new reinforced windows. Her desk had been replaced, so had the carpet. The only thing out of place was a bouquet, 12 ivory roses, 1 red camellia. Adriana stopped. For half a second, old fear flashed through her. Then she saw the card. No trackers. I checked. D. She laughed. Behind her, Dominic's office door opened. He wore a black suit, no tie, and the expression of a man trying very hard not to look pleased with himself. Adriana lifted the bouquet. You know this is a terrible choice of flowers. I was told symbolism can be reclaimed. By whom? Matteo. Matteo also thinks 24 bodyguards is subtle. 24 was appropriate. She shook her head and set the flowers down. Dominic looked at them, then at her. Who bought you those flowers? Adriana stared. He kept a perfectly straight face. She walked toward him. I have no idea. Some dangerously jealous man with boundary issues. Dominic's eyes warmed. Should I be concerned? Very. She stopped in front of him. Months earlier, that distance had felt like a battlefield. Now it felt like a choice. Dominic lifted one hand and waited. Adriana closed the last inch herself. His palm settled against her cheek. The kiss was slow, restrained, and far more dangerous to her heartbeat than any shouted declaration could have been. When they separated, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. Dinner tonight? He asked. Are you asking or ordering? Asking. Then yes. He glanced toward his office. The heavy magnetic lock had been replaced after the shooting. Adriana followed his gaze. Thinking about locking the door? She teased. No. Liar. A rare smile appeared. Dominic stepped backward into his office and deliberately left the door wide open. Adriana looked at it, then at him. It was such a small thing. For anyone else, it would have meant nothing. For Dominic Vale, it was trust. For Adriana Hart, it was the difference between being protected and being possessed. She picked up her tablet and followed him inside. The door remained open, and this time she stayed because she chose to.